Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Richard Vedder, the author of, among other books, Restoring the Promise, Higher Education in America. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be with you, Erik.
So, Richard, by way of introduction, why don't you talk about why you wrote this book? This was a few years ago, and then we'll get into some of the main claims that the book makes.
Yeah, well, I've been teaching forever. I mean, literally forever. I started teaching in the mid-'60s. So I just finished my 56th year of teaching, or I'm in the middle of my 56th year of college teaching. So I've been around the block a few times. I've seen colleges and universities in a wide variety of situations and in different geographic areas, particularly in the U.S., of course. And I've noticed, changes that I think are concerning about higher ed. It's become, of course, very expensive, much more so than before. It's highly inefficient. There's issues about whether students are learning anything. There are issues about whether people can express themselves fully and freely, whether higher ed is really the marketplace of ideas that it used to be. There's a mismatch between what the students learn or are perceived to have learned and what labor markets want in the way of skills, maybe. I think there is some evidence of that. So there's a whole variety of problems with respect to higher ed that have grown over time. And they're important. And I, having been around the field for 55 or 60 years, I think I have some perspective on it that may be unique and different. So I wrote a book about 20 years ago. I wrote my first book on this, a book called Going Broke by Degree, which I did for the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. And I wrote that sort of almost as a lark. I figured, what the heck, I've been in higher ed for a long time. I ought to be able to write about it. And that led to a lot of other things. I was appointed to a presidential commission on the future of higher ed, the Spellings Commission. I started a think tank. I did my college rankings for Forbes magazine. I started them and did them for years. So, I've done a lot of things, and I figure this is an area I know a little bit about. Maybe I ought to write about it.
Yeah, the book is really expansive. I mean, some of the main things, points or critiques I see you making, and then, diving in detail in the book are, and you alluded to them a little bit, one is it's too expensive and it's rising, too much student debt also rising, too many students dropping out, too many people going to school, and not completing, too many students underemployed. There's credential inflation that happens. There's basically cartel, oligopolistic market dynamics that prevent competition. And then there's just this, misaligned incentives in the sense that the user is not the buyer, or, sort of like healthcare, we seem to be, abstracting away responsibility or skin in the game on every level. That doesn't seem so hopeful, huh? Did I?
Yeah, Erik, you just rewrote my book for me, or updated it. Very nicely summarized. And, and there are a lot of sub-issues that, you can get into. For example, intercollegiate athletics is unique in the United States. Nowhere else in the world do colleges have sporting teams in the same way we do? And there's special problems associated with that. We have buildings that sit empty 5-6 months of the year. Of course, during the COVID-19 crisis, even more than that. that even when we're in normal times, the buildings are empty half the time. Enormous waste of capital resources. So we have all sorts of problems in higher ed beyond the big ones that you mentioned, and that's why I wrote a book about it.
Yeah, I want to get into sort of how we got here on some of these levels. When you talk about you've been in the field for over 50 years. What do you think have been the biggest contributing factors to some of these? And you go into them in the book, but why don't you sort of talk about the big turning points or the big shifts for how we got here?
Sure. Well, higher ed began in 1636 in the United States, and for the first 150 years, it was pretty much a private activity. In fact, I would say really first 200 years, we started getting our first state universities really in a large number in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the federal government was pretty much totally uninvolved with higher ed at all until till World War II and the GI Bill. We had provided scholarship support for soldiers. That sort of began, and that was like 300 years into the history of the United States. As the government involvement has grown, the amount of resources devoted to higher ed has been increased, and it has become increasingly taught to people by guidance counselors, by teachers, by politicians, that you won't succeed in life unless you have a lot of education, a higher education, a degree. That idea was not prevalent really in America much before World War II. And even in 1970, only 1 out of every 10 adults had a college degree. And so things have changed. And I don't want to blame everything on the government, but the governmental involvement has changed the dynamics, and it's led to more people getting educated, but it's also led to a lot of these problems that we're mentioning. The biggest single, if I had to pick one thing that's happened in the last half century or so that has really changed the dynamics a lot, it's the student financial aid programs of the federal government, or the student loans especially. And that has really not worked out the way people intended it to when it was created half century ago. Had totally unintended consequence. There have been unintended consequences of a huge magnitude, and I think that program has been less than successful. And I spent a lot of time in the book, of course, talking about that.
To unpack what the intentions were and what ended up happening as a result, or where it went wrong?
Yeah, the program started on a big scale with the Higher Education Act of 1965. We had a great society. Lyndon Johnson, after the death of Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson comes in. He proclaims we're going to have a great society, and part of that is a big significant increase in governmental role in a variety of things: medical care, of course, Medicaid, Medicare, but also in higher ed. The Higher Ed Act of 1965 is the biggest part of that, and it was felt that we really need to make it more accessible for lower income people to go to college. An admirable enough goal. It was argued that we don't have perfect capital markets or financial markets existing, and low-income people have trouble getting the resources to go to college, so the government will provide lending assistance to them, low-interest loans. The idea sounds pretty good, and I think in some ways it worked pretty well for the first decade or so. But as the program grew, Congress enormously expanded the scope of it, particularly in 1978. And so that you could borrow money not just if you were a low income person, but if you were a middle income person or even an above middle income person. And right now, the people who have federal student loans, a lot of them are pretty well off. In fact, the average income of people with student loan debt today, among the adults who are actually out in the workforce, is pretty high. A lot of them, of course, are owing money on graduate studies, including medical school or law school, and they have $150,000 debts, but they also have $150,000, $200,000 incomes in some cases. So we're reaching out not just to the poor and the people who have trouble scraping up enough money to go to any kind of college, but we've reached out to a much bigger audience. And colleges just saw this. They said, people, we can meet our budgets. We'll just raise our tuition fees. And a guy named Bill Bennett, he's still alive, former Secretary of Education, back in around 1980, in the late 80s under Reagan. Bill Bennett argued that the federal student loan program is just an open invitation for colleges to raise fees, and that the colleges are the real beneficiary of the program, not people. People end up facing the same burdens because they're paying higher fees than before, and so they have to pay off these loans. So the evidence pretty much supports that. The colleges did raise their fees enormously in the 1980s and 1990s and the 2000s, up to just a very few years ago. And fees were going up 3% a year more than the overall inflation rate. So they, over the course of 40 years, tripled maybe in real terms. It started going up more than people's incomes were going up. So now college was becoming more difficult to finance, even for middle income people, because the fees were getting so high. And of course, as the fees got high, the colleges had this extra money flowing in terms of high tuition fees. And so they expanded their staffs and they started new services. They added an enormous amount of administrative bloat, administrative staff on, which has added quite a bit to costs. So all of this has been sort of financed, I think, more than anything else by the availability of relatively accessible and relatively cheap federal money. That's a big part of the problem, I think.
And can you go a bit deeper in sort of within the federal sort of evolution, like even starting from the GI Bill on, like what are sort of the big acts of regulation and what were their impacts?
Okay, well, the GI Bill came in 1944. And it was a very popular piece of legislation, still in a revised form, still exists, with a feeling that we ought to provide people who participated in the armed forces with a fringe benefit, I guess you would call it. Deferred compensation would be another way to put it. We ought to provide them resources to get a college education. That was followed in the late 50s. We were in the middle of the Cold War, and we had a scare as a nation. We got almost paranoid about it because the Russians launched Sputnik in 1957, the first man-made satellite, and there was a growing feeling that America was falling behind scientifically, behind the Russians, and therefore we needed to do something about that. So we had a National Defense Education Act, 1957, 1950, I think it was 57, 58, where we started providing more first loans and also scholarship money, grant money, fellowship money to promote especially the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, with money. And then, as I say, in the 60s, we had the Higher Education Act, which had several dimensions to it. but a big part of it was federal financial assistance for the first time to colleges. The next big thing was the creation of the Department of Education, which comes at the end of in 1978. There was a big expansion of the student loan programs then too, and that comes in the late 70s. And so we created for the first time, the federal government started getting more and more involved in what colleges and universities were doing. And, until then, it was pretty much a local state responsibility. The federal government collected a little bit of data, but that was about it. And so that happened in the late 70s and has, of course, expanded. In the science area, we put in rules and regulations at the federal level to protect the integrity of science. And of course, we had expansion of the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and so forth. So the federal government in 1940 was virtually not involved at all in scientific research at the university level, became heavily involved as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that have happened.
Yeah. No, thanks for that overview. I heard of someone joking the other day that if, although I guess he was serious in his intent, that if the government today was asked to create the Manhattan Project, the way they would do it is calling for sort of RFPs, people submitting, a lot of bureaucracy, and it would never get done, basically.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of that early stuff was done out of desperation. Yeah. All the World War II scientific research, that Manhattan Project, involved universities. One of the most pioneering things in atomic research occurred at the University of Chicago in 1942, I think it was. And university facilities were very important, and university personnel were very, very important in the Manhattan Project, and a whole host of important scientific people came to the United States. Albert Einstein being the most famous, from other countries, some of them fleeing from Nazi Germany, Jewish scientists. And the United States got involved in the 40s. And I think most people think that was a great thing, and it was done very well, and it was done in a relatively simple way without a huge bureaucracy and a lot of hearings and so forth. And we got the job done. Exactly.
Yeah. And so before going, digging into where we're going in the future, I want to go back even further. You mentioned within the 1600s of when the first university in the United States, today people talk about sort of, what is the purpose of a university? Is it, is it career development? Is it sort of this, cultivating citizens, liberal arts? There's sort of, I'm curious how you think about, what is the purpose or purposes of a university on sort of a, descriptively, how has that evolved over time? If we can go even back to sort of the origin of universities outside of the U.S.,
yeah,
and then prescriptively today, what should that be?
Yeah, that role has changed dramatically, and that's something that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's really a striking change. Someone actually added up all the students going to American colleges at the time that the American Revolution took place in 1776. And there were, I want to say, 800 students. I'm rounding that number off a little bit. And of those 800 students, about a quarter of them were becoming ministers. A large part of the early emphasis in colleges was on building virtue. We want to have virtuous people who believe in the Ten Commandments, people who are caring towards others. And there was a that very strong element of that in early American higher education. And in fact, I would say it was a dominant factor up until the middle of the 19th century. And even when I went to college way back in the dark ages of the 1950s, some schools still had chapel where students were mandated to go and both for religious exercises and to hear philosophic presentations and so forth about the role of citizens in our society and so on. So that role was a big role at the beginning. It has become much less of a role over time. Someone might argue that it is the decline in that role may have hurt our nation. That's a subject for another day, maybe. The emphasis on early on was on teaching and research. By the way, in the colonial era, people went to college at 15, 16 years of age. We didn't have high schools in those days. We didn't have very many schools of any kind. Most people were self-educated. Let's see, how old was Thomas Edison when he graduated from the College of William and Mary? He was under 20. He was 19, I think, when he graduated. He entered at 16 and left at 19. And by the way, a lot of people went for 3 years in those days rather than 4. So colleges stressed also classical education, including the study of Latin and Greek in the 19th century to a considerable extent. The Morrill Act, which is overrated as an important factor, but it was a piece of federal legislation that was passed during the Civil War, and it created the land-grant colleges. And the land-grant colleges are important colleges. They're the main flagship state universities in most states in the United States. There are an awful lot of very important universities that were founded around 1868 or 1870. The University of California would be one, a good example. The University of Illinois would be another one. I could go on, and Ohio State, go on with a lot of very important universities that were created out of the Morrill Act. So the federal government did get involved a little bit. And the idea is that we need to make education more practical and meet vocational needs of our nation, which at that time included partly agriculture and partly sort of engineering. We need to increase engineering emphasis and agricultural emphasis. So we have universities now with the word A&M in them, Texas A&M University. The A was agriculture and the M was mechanical, referring to engineering type advances. So that sort of practical emphasis grew in the late 19th century, and even more, of course, in the 20th century.
What should be I presume you think that some of the shift in purpose of higher education, some of it made sense at the time. How should we think about, especially given that it's so federally funded, the purpose of higher ed today, and where should it evolve, if at all?
Well, it's a good question. Should higher ed be sort of a vocational activity? Is the purpose of higher ed today to provide human capital, skills to people, to allow them to do higher order things that are difficult to do without a good bit of educational background? A lot of people think the answer to that is yes. But it is also true, and I think Bryan Caplan at George Mason University makes this point probably the strongest of anyone, is it's also true that most of the things that we teach in universities, although they may be very interesting subjects and they may add to a person's well-being in some fashion, they're not really that important in terms of improving skills on jobs. Taking courses in history or philosophy or even almost any of the traditional liberal arts disciplines, for example, fine arts disciplines, learning how to paint or learning how to act or in a play and so forth, theater and so on. A lot of these things we teach that are not areas where we have a strong need for vocational advancement in our nation. The exceptions may be in the area in the sciences, and perhaps some of the business disciplines serve well. I think you really need to go to college to learn how to be an accountant, for example. So the vocational importance of higher ed, I think, sometimes gets overstated a little bit. People get with college degrees make a lot more than those without. But the reason they make more isn't so much because of what they learned in college, in most cases, but because they are smarter to begin with. They're more disciplined. They worked harder in high school. They're more responsible people. And businesses, employers want to hire people who are responsible, who are going to come to work every day, who are bright, who have initiative, and so forth. And college graduates, even those majoring in philosophy and history and subjects like that, are better than those who without a college education, by and large, on average. So we pay college graduates in the United States, anywhere from 50 to 75%, even 100% more than the typical high school graduate. And part of that is related, has nothing to do with what they learned in college, but more to the personal characteristics of the people. College is a screening device. It's a way of screening out the best and the brightest, the smartest, the most disciplined, the hardest working from those who are less, fewer of those attributes.
Yeah. And so what are your predictions for the future? Like how is, if we're having this conversation in 2030, what do you think the biggest changes will be different, right? If we had the conversation in 2011, I don't know if that much would have been different. You can push back on that, but I don't know how much has changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm an economist, and economists are the world's worst predictors of the future. But they're also the ones who are expected to predict. Somehow we're supposed to be knowledgeable about the future. So I will engage in my predictions. The Reverend Thomas Malthus in 1798 wrote a book. This is a historical aside. He wrote a book called The Essays on Population, where he predicted people would live in a bare subsistence level from this point on because population would keep growing and the law of diminishing returns would keep output from rising very much. Productivity would fall because there are too many people for too little land. And the world was going to go to hell. He said that 200 years ago, and it was spectacularly, extraordinarily wrong. So with that by way of background, I will make a prediction. I think higher ed for the next decade, at least, is in for a good bit of trouble. It's going to have a good bit of challenges. Enrollments have fallen since 2011. That's a factual statement. It was going on before the pandemic. There's no indication it will change. There were fewer Americans born in the year 2019, that is to say last year, than in 2003. The ones who were born in 2003 are the ones who will be entering college about a year this fall. They're 18 now, and they're entering college this fall. But we, Americans, have stopped having babies for some reason. I'll leave it to others to analyze that one. But we have had a very, very low and declining birth rate. We have had uncertainties and restrictions in immigration to the United States. And that's something that's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, but we're probably not going to have an enormous upsurge in immigration. So enrollments in colleges and universities are not likely to rise in the next decade much in the United States, and they may fall. A lot of colleges that are sort of hanging on by the thread are probably going to go out of business. The late Clay Christensen, who was a Harvard professor, business professor, who was very well known, predicted that literally thousands of colleges would fold, and it hasn't gone quite that rate, but it's getting there. I can, well-known schools, respected schools, Mills College in California just announced its closing. We've had other schools. Wells College in New York is on the brink, and so forth. Schools that are going closing simply because there are not enough kids wanting to attend. So I think now the politics are hard to predict, and the current administration is very pro higher ed, and they will throw a lot of money into higher ed. They're trying to right now. They already have thrown quite a fair amount, and it may be that the dynamics will change. I may be wrong. We may have a liberal, progressive, Democratic administrations for the next decade or two that'll push higher ed. And I may be completely wrong, but the trend has been not very encouraging. And the public, you ask the Gallup polls, surveys, and surveys done by other organizations, Pew Trust and so forth, the Pew organization, have looked into, what does the public think about our colleges? How confident are they that they're doing a good job? Do they provide good value? They ask questions like that. And there's been a pretty substantial decline in Americans who indicate enthusiasm and support for higher ed. I don't want to overstate it, but the numbers have gone down considerably in the last decade or two as costs have risen and as other things have happened. Campus protests and other things probably haven't helped matters any either. So there's a little less public support for the enterprise than was the case a decade or two ago.
Yeah. There's this one stat somewhere, since 1520, only 85 institutions have remained continuously in existence. Around 70 of them are universities. Why are universities, despite, many people thinking they're sort of poor products, why are they so resilient? They last longer than, tech monopolies, right? Like Microsoft or IBM.
Yeah, the universe. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And, in the private, just to extend the introduction to the question a little bit, in the private sector, Joseph Schumpeter popularized this, talked about creative destruction. That in the private business sector, nearly every company that is successful at one point becomes unsuccessful at some other point, and sometimes goes out of existence. Eastman Kodak was hot 25 years ago. It was a big company. It was a major company. It's essentially bankrupt today. Exxon, Exxon, I would say that about Exxon, but there's a whole variety of these companies. I probably shouldn't name them all, but that have just gone broke. But in universities, because there is third parties paying part of the bills. The third parties are governments. They're rich alumni of these schools, philanthropists who funded some of these schools. A man named Leland Stanford financed Stanford University. A man named John D. Rockefeller financed the University of Chicago. A man named Johns Hopkins financed Johns Hopkins University in the 19th century. In this century, a lot of the funding has come from government, but we have people who believe in universities. So the universities are less dependent on their customers, the people who pay the bills for the services the universities provide. they're less dependent on them than the people in the elsewhere. So the only institutions that remain, I think, well, I would say the Catholic Church it's hung around for quite a while, but it too is not a profit-making organization. In fact, they're losing money like crazy these days, I'm told. Universities are highly dependent on goodwill of the public, highly dependent. And I think they've been a little arrogant, in my opinion, a little taking this for granted a little too much, and showing less humility than perhaps they should. And as a consequence, there's been some decline in public support. And I think it's going to lead to more colleges closing as we go on. There are a lot of kids that graduate from these lesser, well-known state colleges and private, and also small private colleges, who are having a hard time getting jobs that are very good these days. And they're paying a lot to go to these schools, and they got a lot of debt. So the enrollments at these colleges are falling like crazy. A large number of smaller state schools in the state of Pennsylvania are being merged together in an attempt to try to keep them from totally failing. The same thing is going on in many other states as well. And a lot of, as I say, I think this trend is not over yet. I think it's going to continue I'd be very surprised if fewer than 500 schools close over the next decade. It may be much more than that. That's a pretty healthy number.
What would need to be true for sort of universities to have their to lose their sort of monopoly on I don't even know what to call it, prestige, or is it just that it was so obvious? In what world would government pull back their sort of entitlements or their spending on universities because some politician is trying to appeal to the public? What needs to happen, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I think the universities could lose their political appeal. One way they could lose their university appeal, their political appeal, of course, is alternative forms of doing what universities purport to do. If those alternative forms happen, new technologies, of course, we a decade ago we thought the MOOCs, massive online courses, would be the solution, and that we would offer by computer the capacity for students to learn an awful lot for zero or very low cost. But as we've learned during this pandemic, there are some limits to remote instruction and what it can do. But there are, more and more people who say we ought to think about something other than the 4-year degree. These coding academies have been fairly successful, several of them. You go and you take an intensive course in computer coding, which takes a lot of effort and very bright people to do it. But there are people who can do it, and they can go to these coding academies, and after a year or so of instruction, go out and get a very good job. And in some cases, they can do it for nothing. If the colleges accept them, the coding academies accept them, they'll say, "Come to our place, and we need to get X number of dollars from you. But if you don't have the money, well, we'll enter into an income share agreement with you, where at the end of your career at the coding academy, you'll go out and get a job, and you'll give us maybe 10% of your earnings for 10 years or some such term to pay off the costs." And there are academies that are doing this, and so this kind of alternative to traditional higher ed could catch on. It has to some extent already, Whether it will become bigger and bigger, I don't know. But I think it's a possibility.
Yeah. People like Peter Thiel and Bryan Caplan have, at least among the sort of intelligentsia, I would say, somewhat exposed higher ed, the small group of people they've exposed it to. But I'm curious, one, if that will become more mainstream, where people would just sort of like lose faith in it. But two, I'm sure you agree with Thiel and Caplan on a lot of things. Is there anything you disagree with them on?
I'm big on both of them. I've been on TV with Thiel once or twice, and Bryan and I are buddies. I read Caplan's book, The Case Against Education, and I thought he maybe overstated things a little bit and exaggerated a little bit, and I had minor quibbles with it. But education right now, there is a sheepskin effect. You get this piece of paper. Used to be a sheepskin, now it's a piece of paper. You get a piece of paper that is somehow worth a couple $100,000 or maybe $1 million to you, because as a result of having that piece of paper, you can get a job that pays a lot more than if you don't have that piece of paper. And at some point, some people are going to say that's kind of irrational. There are ways people can be certified for being certified competency without getting that piece of paper and going to school for 4 or 5 years and paying enormous tuition fees and so on. And so we're looking for alternatives. Higher ed also, we have all sorts of barriers to entry. We have the accreditation rules that are crazy, make no sense. They're run more or less by the colleges themselves, who are trying to keep competitors out. The antitrust people who want to really do something productive ought to go after that. They ought to go after the accreditation agencies and sue them out of existence, maybe. I don't know. It wouldn't bother me if they did. You don't have to be accredited to buy a car. You can go out and buy an automobile that's not accredited, but you can't go out and buy a college degree that is not accredited. And why is that? And does that make a lot of sense? Maybe we ought to rethink that. Anyway, throw that out for what it's worth. Peter Thiel would agree with me, I think. I love Peter Thiel's idea of let's identify very bright kids who are college-age kids. Most of them may be in college for a year or two. 19-year-old kids who show a lot of talent, a lot of entrepreneurship, brimming with ideas. Why don't we bribe those people to drop out of college and try their skills as entrepreneurs? That's what Thiel's doing. Higher ed is slow to innovate. It has been resistant to innovation. And there are some institutional reasons for it. The institution of tenure probably hasn't helped any. We have a lot of people who have sort of vested interest in keeping things the way they are. There are no incentives, very modest incentives to try to do things differently. There are very modest incentives to cut costs. There are very modest incentives to innovate in ways that will improve learning. I'm not saying they're non-existent, but they're not as strong as they are in the traditional for-profit private sector. And therefore, we have an incentive problem in higher ed. And that's why I kind of like some of these alternative things that are coming up. I like coding academies. I like alternatives to traditional degrees. I like competition. We need competition. And it's been lacking to some extent.
Yeah.
The accreditors tend to put cold water on any attempts to do things differently. You've got to have, we measure things by the inputs used rather than by the outcomes achieved often. for example, just to pick one thing. And so therein lies another problem.
Yeah, you can imagine, like in a dream world, but also like somewhat feasible. Like, could you imagine? I guess a few things. One is, governments giving money to students rather than, via the schools. Like, just give the money directly to the students, and maybe even like subsidizing, not to the extent that it is subsidized, maybe less so in access, but more so in outcomes, like job pathways, and then lastly, like some sort of skin in the game, such that the dropout crisis, universities like pay some of their way so that
absolutely. And rarely, occasionally, we'll get a college president who trying to do some of these things. Mitch Daniels at Purdue University is a good example. He hasn't increased tuition in 9 years there. Which allowing for inflation means that tuition has actually fallen about 15%, and the school is flourishing. And, because he's doing things different. He's income share agreements, skin in the game, absolutely. Colleges who flunk out a lot of kids, or who have a lot of kids who don't graduate, or a lot of kids that don't even make it to the sophomore year, and particularly colleges who have kids who are defaulting on their federal student loans, those colleges should have to pay a price for that, a consequence. And that maybe they ought to pay part of that debt back that is owed to society. And if that happened, you would have some big changes in the way colleges behave. And but if you told the people in Washington you wanted to do that, there are some that would agree with you, but you won't get very far in the Congress right now with that proposal, which is, I think, unfortunate.
Yeah. What do we do? What is sort of the state of research, right? There's sort of, teacher, professors, and I hear like things are good for administrators, bad for professors or certain professors. There's this, they're sort of miserable. There's this challenge between sort of, researching and teaching. Why don't you talk about sort of the state of,
research?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the state of research, I think research is perhaps in less trouble than instruction, but that isn't to say it's doesn't have its problems. I think I wrote a piece for Forbes 6 months ago that I think got 100,000 page views or something astronomical number, where I sort of said America is losing its lead in science. The Chinese universities are going ahead of us, and we have shown some decline in our support for just pure scientific kind of research and so on. And so that is an issue. I think we're crazy on some things we do in the way we finance research. We have something called overhead money that we give to schools when they get a federal grant. They, let's say, a professor gets a federal grant for $500,000. There usually will be money added on for the institution to cover expenses associated with the buildings and with administrative costs and so forth. And those amounts are negotiated, and they run 30%, 40% at some schools and 60 or 70% at other schools. It's a crazy system. It makes no sense. There's a number of people who've looked at it who would agree with that assessment. So there are some things in the research area that need to be changed, but I think we have a lesser problem there. The one problem we have is outside of the area of scientific research. The law of diminishing returns is in effect. That is to say, if you have 500 people researching a problem, some of those people are probably not going to add very much to human knowledge. If you have one person or two persons researching it, the contribution made by those one or two people may be fairly significant. But when you had a 401 or 402 or 502 person, you have a problem. I'll give a quick example. In a 20-year period at the beginning of this century and going back the last few years of the last century, we had 20,000 articles written in scholarly journals on William Shakespeare, roughly 1,000 articles a year. That is 3 papers a day written on Shakespeare, Monday through Sunday, holidays included. Every 8 hours, a new paper on Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare was a wonderful, insightful, important contributor to our heritage. But how much new do we know about Shakespeare? Or we get most of those papers were read by almost no one. And so we give professors low teaching loads at many universities to write papers that no one reads. No one reads, or maybe 5 people read. Why are we doing this? Wouldn't we be better off telling those professors to teach more and do less of this very marginal research? So some research is, I would argue, of questionable productivity. And I don't want to pick just on the professors in English literature. I'm sure the same thing may be true in some of the scientific areas as well. So our research efforts should be reevaluated, I think. But I think we're probably in a little bit better shape in the research area than in the teaching area, where we have a lot of problems. One of which we haven't even talked about is a growing concern that people are afraid to say what they think. Yeah, that's pretty bad in a university. I mean, one thing about a university, they're kind of crazy places. But one of the kind of cool things about them is you can say whatever you think. And there's a battle of ideas going on, and that this is how the world advances. And that's been under some attack lately.
I mean, what's most fascinating to me is how you would think that some universities would sort of like stand up to it, but it seems that they all sort of move in lockstep, that there's like no difference on these issues that from like Stanford or Harvard or Princeton, or how do they all, and yet it's all decentralized and yet they all move in the same direction?
Yeah, there's a wokish progressive ideology that seems to dominate most American universities. And I guess you're considered, you're not part of the club or part of the respectable intellectual community if you deviate too much. There are some exceptions. A lot of us were very, very happy with the University of Chicago, for example, when they adopted something called the Chicago Principles, which more or less says people should be able to say anything they want on campus, pretty much, without fear. And there have been a number of schools that have adopted those kind of rules, but there are a number of other schools that have not, and have chased off people who have somewhat nonconformist kind of viewpoints. And that scares me a little bit. I mean, Galileo, we go all the way back to the Renaissance was really a revolt against conformity. It was. That's what it was. I mean, Galileo had a hell of a time existing, and the Renaissance was to allow for the Galileos of the world and the Isaac Newtons of the world and the John Lockes of the world, to the people who modernized our civilization. It allowed them to come forth and flourish. And universities are important in that, and we should try to maintain that.
And when we talk about that importance and how that's evolved over time, John Haidt, has the idea of, truth you instead of sort of an activism ethos, which has its purpose, but maybe not in the university or not in all universities. And like, what is the intellectual sort of foundation for? Is it like John Stuart Mill? Is it, you just mentioned John? Like, what is sort of the tradition by which it's drawing on?
I think it's drawing on the Renaissance tradition. It's drawing on Mill, yeah. I think Mill would be a good example of it, but it goes back earlier. I think you find it in Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence. You find it in John Locke on human understanding. You find it everywhere. The Renaissance and the Reformation began the modern era, and they were questioning old ideas and old ways of doing things, and the tolerance of change grew, and you've got to have a tolerance for that, and that happened. I started in the 15, 16, 1700s, and it's persisted pretty much up to now with little quirks, of which, I mentioned the McCarthy era was a quirk. It was a aberration, but I'm worried that the new aberrations of the last decade or so are equally bad, maybe even worse, and are a little bit frightening. There's the Heterodox Academy, Jonathan Haidt, you mentioned, the National Association of Scholars. There are a variety of organizations that have come up concerned about the lack of academic freedom and the suppression of ideas in the academy. And I think these organizations are doing good work.
Yeah. It's a good place to wrap. I'll maybe ask one big question in closing, which is, it's sort of, you can answer any one of these two or both. If you one of them is
a choice question. I like that.
Exactly. If you were the president of Harvard, what would you do? And the other is, if you were given $500 million or some crazy amount of money to start a new university, what could that look like?
Well, when you said, I can answer that last one maybe, but I want to draw on something you said earlier that I didn't pick up on, which relates to that. And that is, I think in public policy, we ought to give more money to students and to consumers than to producers or to colleges. I don't think we ought to give money to colleges, maybe. Maybe we ought to give the money to the students and let them, choose where they want to go to school, and the colleges can charge whatever they want if they choose. And we, at least in public education, we ought to be doing much more of reward. It's like a voucher system in K through 12 schools. We ought to give the money to the kids and not to the institutions, because the institutions tend to have vested interests who tend to misuse and are highly inefficient. So I think that's the case. I wouldn't even know what to do if I were president of Harvard. I think the first thing I would do is resign. It's a great place, and there are a lot of places like it that are great. But I wonder, really, Harvard has $45 billion in endowment for 20,000 students. That's over $2 million a student. If you invested those dollars at 4% or 5%, you can have about $100,000 a year coming in income for each student that goes to those places. So these schools are obscenely rich. And there's an issue of equity and fairness. And should we give people tax deductions to give more money to the Harvards of the world? I think a case could be made we shouldn't. Maybe we should tax endowments, which we are to a very minor extent already for very wealthy schools. Maybe we need to equalize things a bit more that way. The people on the left should be in favor of that, but they all went to Harvard, so they're against it. They don't want to talk against their alma mater. I say they all went to Harvard. Many of them went to elite schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, so on. And anyway, I've talked enough, my friend. Good luck to you, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, this has been a great episode. It was great to meet you. I really enjoyed this conversation. And when you have the next book out, let's do another one.
I'd
I look
love
forward
to.
to it.
Thanks, Erik, so much for inviting me.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.